The idea for a nation, for a people to have its own country cannot die and cannot be irrelevant.
Actually, what this stuff, inspired mainly by the Quebec provincial election, should ignite is a little bit of thought about our absolutely feeble, weak, and even ungrateful talk of separatism is right now.
Now, we were not consulted on the kind of harmony that you'd like to have in Canada.
Monsieur le Président, le Canada anglais doit comprendre d'une façon très claire que quoi qu'on dise et quoi qu'on fasse, le Québec est aujourd'hui et pour toujours une société distincte, libre et capable d'assumer son destin et son développement. Merci.
Today, we'll be talking about Quebec separatism, what it is, where it comes from, and why so many Quebecers feel that they'd be better off without the rest of Canada. In Canada, among Anglophones, the attitude toward Quebec separatism is, shall we say, unsympathetic. There's a great video of René Lévesque, an important figure for the separatist movement in the 70s and 80s, where he's speaking to a group of students at Scarborough College. And one of the students, in his question to René Lévesque, says to his face that Quebecers are just bellyaching about their position in Canada. The general picture that people seem to have of Quebec is that they get a great deal out of Canada, and yet they're always threatening to tear the country apart. I myself have heard my fair share of opinions about Quebec from Anglophones across the country, and as far as I see it, it boils down to two main concerns: language rights and money. Starting with language rights. Canada is officially bilingual, meaning that at the federal level, all services must be offered in both French and English. Now, I've heard people in Southern Ontario, for instance, complain about official bilingualism because, as they see it, nobody in their region speaks French. I lived in British Columbia for a year, and people there complained that French immersion gets so much support and so many resources in the education system of British Columbia, and yet local languages such as, say, Indigenous languages or that of the Doukhobors in the Kootenay region get nothing at all. Some Anglophone Canadians even feel that French has become so privileged as to create a class of bilingual elites, where those who can speak both French and English have access to the highest positions of power in Canada, whereas the average monolingual, let's say Nova Scotian, doesn't have access to power, just in the same way that the average monolingual Quebecer doesn't. The question then becomes, who is this bilingualism serving? There's also the problem of money. Many Anglo-Canadians feel that Quebec gets a really good deal out of Confederation through the system of equalization payments. Basically, the idea is that poorer provinces get an infusion of cash from the federal government in order to pay for things like healthcare and education. The idea is that it affects all Canadians. If some Canadians get a poor education or reduced access to healthcare. And so, we help standardize the quality of education and healthcare across the country by paying for it to some extent as a country. Now, if I'm being completely honest, I don't really understand the nuts and bolts of equalization. But at the end of the day, what matters for us is that Quebec is considered to be a poorer province and so receives equalization payments. Provinces that are not considered to be poor, like Ontario and Alberta, pay out equalization. Many Anglo-Canadians feel that Quebecers have it good, even great. From language rights to equalization, Canada bends over backwards to accommodate Quebec. And yet they want nothing to do with us? Aren't they just bellyaching? Okay, but what do Quebecers think? To get to answering that question, I want to make something very clear. The following is not meant to be a defense of separatism. My goal with this video is to give Anglo-Canadians a sense of how separatists see Canada and their place in it. I am personally not a separatist, and I believe that Canada should continue to include Quebec. At the same time, I have to admit that I can understand where many Quebecers are coming from, and I'm frankly inspired by some of the people who fought for an independent Quebec. The optimist in me hopes that videos like these could help to increase understanding between Quebecers and the rest of Canada. At the end of the day, I'd like Anglophone Canadians to walk away from this video with a better understanding of why separatism has such staying power for so many people in Quebec. First, let's talk language. In English, I'd argue that we don't actually have a very sophisticated language for talking about Quebec's place in Canada. You'll often hear, for instance, the term Quebec separatist or Quebec separatism. You are either a separatist or you're not. And the language here, I'd argue, actually belies a political position. And to some extent, your political opinion is decided for you even before you begin discussing it. What do I mean? Well, what does separatism mean? Basically, separatism is the idea that there is some unity, some whole that is called Canada, and a separatist wants to disconnect themselves from that unity. They want to take a chunk out of Canada. They want to dissolve the country to some extent, at least as far as their participation in it is concerned. Now you might say, well, yeah, isn't that what we're talking about? Aren't we talking about people who want to separate from Canada, who want Canada as it stands to no longer be a thing? The problem here, I think, is that you're putting the cart before the horse, so to speak. You've reached your conclusion about the politics even before you've begun discussing them. As it stands, a separatist wants to destroy something. They want to change the status quo. And I think for many Canadians, this triggers a sort of essential conservatism. Do you want to destroy Canada? Well, separatists do. In French, however, there's a lot more potential for nuance because there are two terms instead of just one. On the one hand, we have les fédéralistes, who believe in fédéralisme. In English, we would just say federalists who believe in the political philosophy of federalism. Federalists are ultimately united by the belief that Quebec's best interests are served as part of Canada. Basically, they do not want Quebec to separate from the rest of the country. Opposing les fédéralistes, we don't actually have les séparatistes. Instead, we have les souverainistes, whose political philosophy is called souverainisme. A clunky translation of these two terms might be sovereigntists and sovereigntism, but those in English who are uncomfortable with the term separatist or séparatiste usually talk around it and use the term the sovereignty movement. But why bother telling you any of this? Well, if we compare these two terms with separatism, we can find once more a political position contained within the language itself. A sovereigntist's political aims are not to break up that unity called Canada. Instead, their goal, their political aim, is to gain sovereignty for themselves, for their people. Sovereignty here means having dominant political power over a region. It means having your own parliament, passing your own laws, taxing your own people. I'd argue that sovereignty as a concept should be seen really as a sliding scale. In Quebec, they do have their own parliament. It's in Quebec City and it's called l'Assemblée nationale. They pass laws there, they tax their people. But is l'Assemblée nationale the dominant political power? Obviously not. They don't control immigration, at least not fully. There's no army of Quebec, so they rely on the Canadian army for national defense. And Quebecers also pay taxes to Ottawa, to the federal government of Canada. Adherents of the sovereignty movement, therefore, would like this to not be the case. They want full control over immigration. They want an army of Quebec, and they absolutely do not want to pay taxes to Ottawa. Okay, all of that may be true, but what is the difference between sovereigntism and separatism? Why bother worrying about these two terms if they ultimately amount to the same thing? Aren't we just making a distinction without a difference? Well, surprise, surprise, I'd argue that it actually is pretty important. I'd argue that by using the term separatist, you've already decided what your position is going to be on the question of Quebec's place in Canada. The term separatist presupposes the validity of that unity called Canada. It contextualizes and understands any discussion about the question within the context of Canada rather than on its own terms. And by using the term separatist, I think we are oversimplifying a pretty complex issue as one about destroying or not destroying Canada. Now you might at this point say, well, doesn't the same thing apply to sovereigntist? Haven't we already decided our political position when we use that term? Isn't the whole point of these political terms to help us make sense of this complicated world of politics? And yeah, absolutely. They certainly have a political position, and that's why we use that term. But don't forget, in Quebec, you have options. You can also be a federalist. You can also be for the preservation of Canada. Now, this is not to say that an English speaker can't call themselves a federalist, but for me, the conversation doesn't really seem to have gotten there yet among most English speakers. For most English speakers outside of Quebec, the question is, do you want Quebec to separate or not? And since they don't live in Quebec, most of the time the answer is going to be no. Do you want to destroy your country? No? Okay, well then you're not a separatist. But what if the question changed? What if it became, do you think provinces should have more local autonomy? In other words, more sovereignty? I think reframing the question like this can make it seem a lot more identifiable to people. And it also allows us to see sovereignty itself as a sliding scale. I think that choosing to see this as a question of sovereignty versus federalism could serve to unite people with similar aims across the country. Whether you're a federalist or whether you're a sovereigntist, you might see people in Quebec who are fighting towards similar aims as your natural allies, rather than, in the case of sovereigntists, whiners, bellyachers who already get so much from Ottawa. At the same time, I wonder if we adopted this more expansive view of sovereignty rather than separatism, if it could serve to temper the more extreme elements within Quebec itself. So, now that we have some better language for dealing with the sovereignty movement, I'd like to move on to a discussion of the origin and development of the sovereignty movement throughout Canadian history. And I've divided the following section into 3 parts. The origins and development of the French colony of New France, the period of British control after the conquest until Confederation, and then the emergence of neo-nationalism during the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s. Let's go back, way back, to the 17th century. For even the most casual student of Canadian history, the importance of the fur trade has reached the point of being almost a cliche. Quebec, or rather New France as it was called at the time, was founded as a means of controlling the fur trade. This medium-sized rodent, the beaver, produced a pelt that could be refined into a fine felt used in the making of luxury hats. Abraham Lincoln, for instance, owes his branding, at least in part, to the fur trade. Quebec City itself was built by Samuel de Champlain at the point on the St. Lawrence Seaway where it begins to narrow and then penetrates ever deeper into the continent of North America. But the land he chose to establish the colony wasn't just useful for access to the fur trade. The lowlands of the St. Lawrence, today the heartland of Quebec, represented and still do a unique physiographic region in North America. One warm line, if you will, of arable land through the rugged Canadian shield. Politically, the situation wasn't exactly ideal for Samuel de Champlain, as we'll see, but it turned out to be pretty great for the people who would come to call themselves Quebecers. The colony of New France was from the beginning considered at best an afterthought, and at worst, a complete waste of resources. Samuel de Champlain had to return frequently to France in order to convince the French crown to fork over the pittance required to maintain the colony. And even then, it was never clear that any kind of permanent society would ever take root. In fact, in spite of the strategic value of Quebec at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, many merchants at the time opposed the building of a permanent settlement. They saw a permanent colony as a waste of resources when trading posts such as those in nearby Acadia or at Tadoussac had worked just fine up until now. Champlain obviously disagreed, and he seemed to be on track for achieving his goal in 1627 when a joint stock company called La Compagnie des Sans Associés was founded to help fund the colony. However, in a moment of historical foreshadowing, Just 2 years later, in 1629, a small English fleet actually succeeded in capturing the colony and would hold it for the next 5 years. Champlain himself would actually die in Quebec City a few short years after its return to French control. But in the absence of Champlain's vision and energy, the colony would go pretty much ignored by the French crown for the next 30 years. But was this neglect necessarily a bad thing? An example of the possibilities of benign neglect are les voyageurs, or les coureurs des bois. These were the French fur traders of the age, who, guided by the Huron allies of New France, would set out on long expeditions deep into the Canadian wilderness. There, they enjoyed a degree of freedom and personal independence unimaginable in most of the world at the time. In fact, when in 1665, Louis XIV tried to exert a degree of control over the colony and guide it into more profitable waters, his envoy, Jean Talon, would find it pretty difficult to exert control over les voyageurs, who had gotten used to their way of life. Turning to Jean Talon, we get what amounts to the second interlude of French interest in the colony of New France. But it wasn't to last. So for Jean Talon, it turns out that building what amounts to a fortified cabin in the wilderness, in a country which gets between 3 and 5 months of winter a year, and which has infrastructure suited almost exclusively to the fur trade, attracts mostly fur traders and few women. In 1665, the population was almost exclusively men, and all that arable land that Champlain had had his eyes on was going uncultivated. Louis XIV wanted to change the situation, so he sent Jean Talon to New France in order to principally increase the population. And in this way, Talon's arrival really heralds the beginning of the Quebecois people, particularly with the arrival of young girls, orphans sponsored by the King of France, known as les filles du roi, or the King's daughters. Provided with a dowry and the goal of finding a marriageable husband, these women would form the rock upon which future Quebec generations would be based. Now, following this infusion of new settlers, France would again begin to ignore its colony, and New France would have to rely on natural increase in order to secure its position in North America. As it turns out, this actually wasn't that hard. Quality of life was much greater in New France than it was in France proper. Improved nutrition in particular played a big role in reducing infant mortality. It would be another 100 years before the British conquest during the 7 Years' War. And in that time, while the French would garrison and defend the colony, it would undergo a period of what we've already called benign neglect. At the end of the day, Quebec is just far from France, and even more so in practical terms for the 16th and 17th centuries. The French philosophe Voltaire gives us probably the best example of the general attitude of the French toward New France during the period, when he refers to the region as just a few acres of snow. New France was a place you not only did not have to think about, but probably just didn't anyways. This is particularly the case for France. Think about it. This is a country that shares many land borders with other European countries, and it has to balance the interests of a navy and fielding a continental army to protect itself. At the end of the day, when you're balancing New France against the other more immediately lucrative provinces in the Caribbean, New France is just always going to lose out. The consequence in New France was a high degree of local autonomy with respect to the French crown, and even the Catholic Church. Now, converting the indigenous people of North America was always a priority for New France and for pretty much all Europeans. But the reality of actually doing so in New France had really interesting consequences for the way Catholicism was expressed in the colony. Now, I do want to be very careful here. On the one hand, it does seem that the Jesuits were more respectful of indigenous cultures than, say, the Puritans in New England or the Spanish in Mexico. They learned local languages, they often lived in the communities that they sought to convert to Christianity, and they adopted local customs in a way that would have scandalized most Europeans of the age. They also tried to, in some cases, adapt their teachings in order to conform with indigenous spiritual beliefs. They were trying to gain the confidence of indigenous peoples in order to bring them over to Christianity on something resembling their own terms. But at the end of the day, we can't forget the cultural chauvinism that is ultimately at the heart of their project of converting the indigenous peoples of North America. The cultural mission of the Jesuits was for indigenous people to abandon their way of life, for the simple reason that the French way was superior. The notion that the French were in some way nicer colonizers in North America than the English or the Spanish, at best serves to whitewash actual French attitudes towards indigenous peoples at the time, and at worst, excuses their contribution to what amounts to be genocide committed by colonial powers in North America. And at the end of the day, this relatively better treatment of indigenous people by the French was not due to some spontaneous goodwill. If we look at how the French treated people in the Caribbean, the slave colony of Haiti being case in point, the idea of nicer colonizers kind of falls out the window. With that said, in the absence of direct French interest in the goings-on of the colony, the colonists themselves were forced much more to work with indigenous people. As a result, something resembling a partnership between the Huron in particular and New France did exist. In addition, the organized church itself seems to have taken much more of a backseat in New France than it did in France proper. Its role would increase, interestingly enough, under British control. Returning to the sovereignty movement, the some 150 years of French rule is, for obvious reasons, seen as the point of origin for the Quebecois people. Its importance for the sovereignty movement is as a period where the state intervened only intermittently. Consequently, what Quebec, or rather New France, would be was largely up to its inhabitants at the time. And this relatively utopian period would come to a screeching halt in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham.